We're going to continue this with Leroy Westerling. He's with UC Merced. He's a fire and climate modeler and a professor there. And I understand he had a fast drive here. So welcome to Sonoma.
Yeah, if you drive when everyone else is asleep, it goes better in California. Well, it's a pleasure to be here this morning. Okay, I'm not good at multitasking, so talking and holding two things is kind of pushing. All right. So wildfire response to climate change in California's central and north coast ranges. I just want to point out I'm from UC Merced, so there is a 10th campus of the UC system, and I've been there 12 years. I actually opened doors for students in the current location 12 years ago. All right, so California has a variety of ecosystems, and they have different responses to wildfire, particularly because they are evolved to grow in different climate contexts. The previous speaker was talking about how we look at the shifting climate envelope on the landscape, and then we try to think about what would grow in that place in a future climate. And I just want to point out, so if you're moving here from the upper right to the lower left, you're basically moving from ecosystems in the Sierra Nevadas, forests, to woodlands and brushlands in the foothills, to sort of grassy coastal hills, and then down to coastal chaparral. And this is just a really coarse cartoon, right? There's a lot more variation than that, of course. But one of the things that characterizes this is basically two transitions. One is from a higher to a lower elevation, and one is from interior to the coast. And that's what typifies a lot of the climate variation in California when you think about it spatially. And the reason we have more trees up in the mountains is in part because we get more precipitation and we get more of it as snow. And what do we know about snow is that it's frozen, right? So it has a nonlinear response to those warming temperatures. As you warm up the temperatures, you can get a nonlinear response where the snow melts. And when it melts early enough in the year, you can get a longer fire season, things can dry out more. So when we look around the Western United States, and in California it's true also, but to a lesser extent, the biggest changes in wildfire that we've been seeing over the last few decades have been in forests up in the higher elevations and mid elevations, because that's where the snow is. When we get down to coastal areas like where you guys are living here, it's much less sensitive to these increasing temperatures. It does have an effect, right? So the warming temperatures promote the atmosphere drawing more moisture out of the soil, out of the fuels, and that means more flammability. And it can also change the variability of precipitation, the timing of precipitation, and how that interacts with wind. So we saw that this fall with the Thomas Fire in Southern California in particular. Not a lot of precipitation late in the year, and then getting into higher wind events. So I'm going to be showing you some fire simulation work that we've been doing. And I want you to keep in mind the statewide context on top of that. So we're going to be zooming into different sections of the coast in a minute. But there's a couple of things to pull from here. One is that our fire modeling for this state is actually modeling individual fire events. So David was talking about looking at how the climate envelope shifts on the landscape, and then looking at what kind of vegetation would grow there if the climate was then stable for a long time and the vegetation had the chance to catch up to its potential, right? And if you do fire modeling like that, you typically end up with a lot of results where it will predict decreases or no change at all in areas where today we're seeing very large increases in fire. And that can be a little confusing, but it's because those results depend on long-term stability, that these changes have to have enough time for the vegetation to catch up to what the potential is for it on the landscape. So the approach we're taking here is a little bit different. What we do is we look at recent variability in climate and the changes year to year and month to month in wildfire that are associated with that around the state. And we try and project that into the future. So we're modeling monthly individual large fire events as they might happen. Now, what that means is that the probability in any one location, I don't know if you really see the dots up there, but if you think about this map as a whole bunch of little pixels, a whole bunch of little squares, okay? And in each of those squares in any given month, the probability of having an extreme event, even in a really dry, hot year, is still pretty small because these are rare events. They don't happen that often. So what we do is we simulate them many, many times, right? So that we can see a lot of years maybe where there are no fires at all or very few fires, but also a few years where there are really big extreme events. And so on the one hand, on the left side here, I've got an example. So these two maps, mostly green, are showing the state, and it's the same month in a simulation. It's the same climate in both places, the same probabilities of fire, but very different realizations. So one of them has a really big fire in coastal areas of Northern California, and the other up on the top has a fire that's still large by historical standards, but it's much smaller. Right? So it's the same probabilities, different outcomes. Now, if I take thousands of these and aggregate them, then on the right I can get a map like what you see there, which is showing sort of the average or expected area that might burn over a period of time for this particular climate. Right? So now I'm going to be showing you for coastal California some of these averages, and they're going to be the percent change from the historic. So how much might it increase by mid-century and by end of century? But one of the things to keep in mind with this approach is that because we're taking recent relationships between climate and fire, and they're assuming that the vegetation looks like it does today. Right? So the further out in time we project these, the less confidence we're going to have in the results. So when we're looking at the ones for the mid-century, we're pretty confident about those. We don't think that over the next few decades the vegetation is going to change so dramatically that the fire characteristics of how fire burns in that location are going to change really dramatically. By the time you get to the end of century, we might be over-predicting fire, we might be under-predicting fire, and it's really hard to say. Okay? But it gives us an idea of what the current vegetation would want to do if tomorrow you presented it with the climate that were projected for 27. So, and then a final note before we delve into some of these projections is they're not predictions, right? We're not actually predicting the future. What we're doing is telling stories about different possible or potential futures. And they depend on a lot of things. It's not just climate in here, but also the population, the development footprint in the future, and what that means for how much vegetation is available to burn, how we manage fuels. So a lot of different things go into these simulations. All right. Here I'm showing just the statewide context in total area burned. So on the left is sort of the average area burned in hectares, not acres, but sort of multiply by 2 to get acres if you want, for the state, so 1961, 1990, and on the right is showing an end of century example. And actually, most of them look very similar to each other. It doesn't really matter which climate model we're looking at because the temperature effects become so dominant by end of century compared to the differences in precipitation. So, but you can see there are very large increases in area burned, particularly in North Coast and in the interior Sierra Nevada and the Southern Cascades. Well, let's zoom in first on the North Coast. So these regions that I'm showing here are actually the ones that are being used by the state for the current fourth climate assessment for the state. So we have reports that are being written for each of these subregions, and they're going to be available to the public fairly soon. And so you'll be able to read about not just fire, but other climate impacts all integrated in one document for each of these regions. And for the North Coast here, now we're looking at percent change by mid-century over 4 climate models, 2 different emission scenarios, a lot of different populations. So this is sort of an average over a lot of different future scenarios. And these red colors up here are showing increases on the order of 300 to 500% or more in the area burned by mid-century. And if we push that out to the end of century, then those areas where we have very large increases of 300% to 500% over the historic area burn become quite widespread. What about a little bit further south, so around the Bay Area? There's a particular hot spot down in San Mateo County. And if you've ever been over there, you know what the vegetation looks like. So there's some open area there with a lot of dense vegetation. And that is where most of the increase that you see is occurring by mid-century in that part of the state. But if you push it out to the end of century, then you start to get a lot in the northern parts near to here. Okay. And finally, if you go down to the southern end of the range that we're considering today, not a lot of change projected by mid-century, and a bit more in sort of these two enclaves at the north and southern ends by end of century. So the further north you are, the bigger the changes that you see in these projections. But these are looking at averages. And really, most of the area that's going to burn in the next century is going to occur in a relatively small number of years in any given location from really large extreme events. And we don't really care that much about changes in the average area burned over this time period for management. What we care about are the scale of these events and the timing, and like how many of them we might have to manage at the same time and what they might look like. And so I'm going to take you through some examples. We have a lot of examples. Okay, so these maps I'm showing you are from a library. We have about 42 million maps of large fire events that we generate for the state just in the last year or so. And what I've done is gone in and selected them, thinking about what is out of 100 simulations for 150 years, just sort of picked at random, what does a really big fire year look like for each of these regions, and then for all of them together. So and I'm showing you the whole state, even though I'm selecting these for what they look like in a particular region. So if I'm just thinking about the North Coast, the two North Coast areas, then the biggest, one of the bigger fire years would have, you could see these big square fires up here. They're square just because that's convenient, right? We can put them in any shape we want in the landscape because we're drawing them out from a point. But think about it this way. This is an example of a really significant fire season with two fires burning simultaneously, not that far from each other. They're both larger than the Tubbs fire. Okay. And at the same time, you've got a third fire burning at the same time, also of that scale. So the larger of those is about 7 times the size of the Tubbs fire. And if instead we looked at an extreme season for the Central Coast, we can easily find an example in our simulations of 3 really large fires burning simultaneously. And one of the tricks with this is that we don't really know how big these fires can get, right? We don't know what we should cap the fire size at. When I was doing this exercise, I capped it at the largest fire size we'd seen in the historic record, which was a forest fire back in 2013. We've since had larger fires and very different vegetation types. So we don't really know what the largest fire is that we should be allowing on these landscapes. But you could have 3 fires that each are much larger than all the fires you had this year up in Sonoma and Napa burning in the same season in the Central Coast. And similarly, if you put the whole coastal region from Santa Barbara up together, this is an example of an extreme fire season that you'd be managing. Really, historically huge fires. These are each like an order of magnitude larger than the Tubbs fire simultaneously in a single season. A statewide fire season, on the other hand, you could have one where it was really extreme statewide, far larger area burn than anything we've seen in the recent historical record, but not at all localized on the coast. It could be driven by the north and central coast, but it could be driven by the south coast and the Sierras. So they're very different potential scenarios to think about. and what they would mean for the resources available to fight these fires simultaneously on, very different parts of the landscape, not even thinking about what could be happening in the same year around the rest of the Western United States. So these provide very significant management challenges to think about. And we could curate these samples to understand what the sort of spatial and logistical challenges would be of managing around events like these in a single year. And I'm going to stop here, and we have time for...
5 more minutes if you want to have it.
No, for questions.
No, we've got 5 more to talk, and then 5 more minutes.
I know, but I'm stopping here and giving you time for questions.
So, you want to go back to the beginning and start again?
No. I didn't want to throw too much at you. I wanted to give you time to talk.
All right, well, then we have a lot of time for questions, so hopefully there'll be a lot of questions. There should be. It's a black box, man.
It is. It's all secret.
Can you assign a probability number to any one of these maps?
We could do that, yes. But the probability is going to represent not the probability of something actually happening in the future, but the probability supported by, one, our best guess about how these processes work, and two, the population of climate models that we've chosen to look at. And a particular issue with this, when Dave was talking, remember he showed you some examples where he showed you a wet future and a dry future. A lot of times when we talk about climate change for this part of the world, we talk about it as though there's a lot of uncertainty. Maybe it'll be wet, maybe it'll be dry, and climate change is driving that. But really, what we have is a really large background variability in precipitation. This is a place that naturally can be very wet or very dry, year to year or decade to decade. And what those climate models show us is that that continues, right? So if you're only looking at
Or maybe it gets more extreme.
Or maybe it gets more extreme. It probably does. The best science that we have now says more extreme, so more wet and more dry. But if you're only looking at 4 climate models, which is what we're doing here, you've only got 4 examples of that random draw of precipitation over 100 years out of a really big natural variability that may be enhanced by climate change. So really what drives differences between these scenarios is not the temperature, because the temperature is almost the same, it's very similar, especially by mid-century across these scenarios. It's the timing of droughts. It's the timing of droughts. If you get a big drought early versus later, it has a different enhancement from the warmer temperatures. Yeah.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could speak to, it looked like the 30-year of present, you selected 61 to 90.
Yes.
Could you talk about why you didn't select something like 80 to 2010?
Sure. So there are different choices that we could make, and there are different rationales for them. In this case, I've been involved in all 4 climate assessments, doing the fire modeling for the state assessments. And in all the previous assessments, we used that reference period, 61 to 1990. And we had a particular reason for doing that at the time, and that was that we really only started to see the impact of climate change on the hydrology, so the timing of snowmelt and the amount of snow versus rain and things like that in the Western United States, in a way that we could be statistically confident that it was something changing somewhere between 1984 and 1987. So that gave us a baseline that wasn't drastically changing from climate change. So now in this 4th assessment, I kept that reference period, both because I like being able to compare to not exactly pre-climate change, but less climate change, and also because I want the results to be comparable across all 4 studies. So that if we're saying there's a 100% increase or 200% increase in this study, it means the same thing if in the one we said 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Is that reasonable? Hi.
Hi. In your fire simulation, do you have the model for ignition, or is that the same for 100 years ago versus the future?
Okay, so if you look around the state, the vast majority of fires are caused by humans, and they're quite small. And they're usually put out fairly quickly. because most people are in places that are pretty accessible. So you actually get most of them along roads and trails and things like that. And what we're looking at here is actually, I should have been clearer about that at the beginning. We're only modeling large fires, so fires over 1,000 acres in size. And that's actually a fairly small fraction of all the fires, but it's the vast majority of the area burned in them. And so there are a lot more ignitions out there than actually can become big fires. And what drives whether they become big fires or not is the climate, the weather. So how dry the fuels are at that time when the ignition occurs. So a model like this is essentially assuming that those background ignitions are not exactly constant, because we include population change, but close to constant, right? And on the other, so the pattern of lightning is basically the same. The pattern of where people go and light fires on landscape is the same. And what changes is whether or not those fires can grow to become big or not.
We've got time for one more.
Can you clarify the results you showed at the end? Were you saying that the extreme years where you have several large fires at the same time, are those going to be more common in the future than they have been in the past? Was that
Yeah.
If you go down to the bottom left, you see the little screen thing that the.
Oh yeah, thank you. Sorry, I went too fast and I outran the end of the slides. So yeah, so actually I want to point out this first one, this extreme fire season in the North Coast, that was in our simulation in 1987. All the others were after 2050. So we actually have some small chance, even with recent historic climate, of a really significant fire season here. It just didn't happen. But if you do enough simulations, right, you can get a result like that. So if you get it, say 1 out of 3,000 simulations in the past, or 30,000 simulations past, it's a really small probability, but it's much easier for me to find them in the latter 50 years of the simulation, so the last half of the 21st century. And so we could put fractions on that, right? We can say probabilities, but again, they're not predicted probabilities about the actual future. They're just a summary of our best guess. All the guesses that went into these modeling exercises, not just the fire modeling, but the climate modeling and all the other processes that are incorporated into that.
So what about the early part of your simulations then? Pretty similar to the past?
They do not. There are a lot more fires in the later part of the simulations.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.